So data and simulation are foundational to planning and management of rail and transit systems. The ever more abundant data and corresponding decision support tools should improve decision making. Regrettably, this is not necessarily the case. Data or methods may be misunderstood or misused, leading to misleading and even outright incorrect conclusions. Our speaker today has experienced these challenges firsthand and served at the front lines in both railroad and consulting context. His observations and insights about simulation he'll provide his insights about simulation and providing the best practices for their use. I'll introduce our speaker, but before I do, how many people here watch Saturday Night Live? So how many people know who has the record for the most guest host appearances? He's number 2. Alec Baldwin's number 1. John Goodwin's 3, and Buck Henry and Tom Hanks are tied for 10. I bring this up because we have our own sort of relatively shorter tradition of bringing back guest hosts or guest speakers, and I believe that Mark either has the record or is tied for the record of 3 now appearances in the Hay Seminar series. I believe you're tied with Mike Franke. So
okay.
Very honorable company there. Anyway, Mark has 15 years of experience studying railroad capacity and operations. He began this work as an undergraduate student here using Rail Traffic Controller, or RTC, conducting research on rail line capacity. He earned both his BS and his MS in civil and environmental engineering here, and he completed an outstanding master's thesis in 2010 on the impact of operational strategies and new technologies on railroad capacity. His experience and education here positioned him well for the next stage in his career. He accepted a position at CSX in their network planning group, where he conducted or supported numerous modeling studies. He transitioned to their finance department, where he studied locomotive utilization and productivity, and then moved to their engineering department, where he managed track geometry cars. This diversity of experiences and departments was invaluable in gaining strong understanding of the complexities of rail engineering, analysis, and operation. After 8 years at CSX, he moved to his current position at HNTB, where he leads their simulation studies on light rail, commuter, freight, and intercity passenger rail on projects throughout the nation. Please join me in welcoming Mark, who will present today's Hay Seminar entitled Use and Misuse of Data, Metrics, and Simulation.
Thank you, Chris. You want to do a microphone check? Can you hear me? Wonderful. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is my 3rd time doing it. My first time was as a grad student, and then I did it at CSX, and now in the consulting world. And hopefully I can share some of each of those have been very different experiences, working in each of those realms, with different challenges and different opportunities. And I've been able to fortunately observe a lot of, it's been an interesting time in the industry with, PSR and growth and changes. And so some of the things I've seen, I'd love to share some of that. I guess one of the first lessons I learned was with that first Hay Seminar. My dad was visiting in a couple weeks, and so I asked Chris, who's going to give the Hay Seminar? And I quickly learned one of life's lessons: don't ask questions you don't want answers to, because Chris told me it was me. So
I think I said, why not you?
Yeah, why not? And when and you can't really say no to that. So. But yeah, let me quickly sort of jump in. We have an exciting time in the industry, or even in the world in general. We've never had greater accessibility of data. There's smart systems, there's different data collections. We're able to collect things that's in computers and not on paper. And so we're able to do data and analytics and simulation that supports decision making. That these are critical things to making smart and intelligent decisions, is to be fact-based with those. And because of that, leaders are increasingly pressured to do just that, to be fact-based, to use this data. But I would argue this is a pressure that sometimes can lead them to misuse this analytical process. Sometimes, to either, and I'll get into some of those quickly. But as I said, there's pressure to provide quick decision making. You make decisions quick, but you're also being challenged to make decisions, fact-based. So the goal is to be, in that first box. to be fast and provide helpful analysis. But there's these others. So you have slow and helpful, but that's really paralysis by analysis. It's not helpful if you can't get it to people quick enough. And then one advantage is if it's fast and wrong, at least that's what we called at CSX, fast failure. At least you can identify something's wrong pretty quickly. But the place you really don't want to be is this bottom, unhelpful and slow. So sometimes you can put in a lot of effort, and it really doesn't tell you anything. So if it just takes a long time, eventually people just stop listening to the data altogether. So what causes this bad and unhelpful analysis? I would sort of argue there are sort of two buckets. There is the unintentional misuse. If people just don't understand the methods or data or metrics or tools. When you ask the wrong thing of the wrong tool or misunderstand what the data does and does not say. And then there's this intentional misuse. A decision's been made, and you have to prove that it's correct. So you go back into the data to try and prove something you've already decided. So there is a serious temptation in those cases to try and find the data to make your superiors happy. And there's examples of that in recent history as well. And then sometimes it's even outside this process. It's just because people are pressured to be fact-based, they just do it to check the box. I've been told simulation is the greatest thing ever if it agrees with you. But if it didn't agree with what they thought, it's just completely wrong and just completely worthless. So, which is it? We have to sort of always use it or always not, or what is that? How do we make these fast, accurate decisions in a helpful way? What I would argue is that sometimes we over-rely on data. We over-rely on science, which I know is a dangerous thing to do coming to an academic location. But there is a spectrum. You have to rely on intuition and experience. You have to use data and science. And different questions require a different balance of those. Some of that depends on the type of analysis. Some tools, some data just won't tell you certain things. There is no data that will tell you, what making employees happy will do, but there is tangible benefits, and this balance honestly has varied over time. I've gone from, where everything was supposed to be fact-based, to, using data and simulation and science, to ignoring it completely and everything's based on intuition. And this sort of depends on leaders of companies and different cultures. And so I said, it's not a static balance. And so one area where experience is required is when the analysis just takes too long. Companies are fast-moving environments. You have to react and make decisions in a quick way. And so while that's where actually academia is perfect, those longer questions that take longer decisions and require some very detailed analysis. But in the industry, those are hard. It is hard to justify spending a long time answering questions. So one of those examples of where data just can't really tell you is what I call, one example is butterfly effects. So what the impact on one, let's say for instance on a railroad, what happens if you improve one end of your network? How does it affect somewhere else? There is benefit. Delays in New Orleans affecting Atlanta, but many of the simulation tools and data analysis just can't. There's so much noise in there. There's so many other impacts. It's hard to come up with a quantifiable benefit. Or another example is reduced coupler failures on dispatching. Dispatchers will make decisions based on avoiding risk. They're afraid that a train will break apart. And so they don't take crossovers, or they will not. They will hold a train back. If they lose that fear of something happening, there's a benefit to that. But can I use really simulation to understand the human element or data? It's extremely difficult. So I'll try and provide you some examples, but as in Anchorman they say, these are based on actual events, but only the names, locations, and events have been changed. Yeah, just for protecting the anonymity.
Protect the innocent and the guilty.
Yes, very much so. So I'll go through sort of different examples through data and metrics and simulation, and then a couple other things. But first, data. It's sort of the holy grail. It's the challenge when you're in academia to get data. It is a challenge when you're in the industry to get data. It is in consulting as well. It is often, for me, now that I'm in consulting, the biggest risk to a project schedule is waiting on data from a client. They don't, often they don't know if the data exists, who owns it, or they're not willing to share. Even at CSX, I was convinced our IT department thought it was their mission in life not to let people use the data. They wanted to, process it through tools, but as an analyst, you want the rawest of raw data possible. And so they didn't want to share where were the databases to get this information. And so it made it difficult. Also, those people are the ones that understand the data itself. There are stories in every data set you'll ever work with. And I'll get a little bit on the next slide, some of those complexities. And you have to understand what goes into a data set. What does it include? What does it not include? And finding those people is often extremely difficult. And then sort of the last point is each entity, each railroad I've worked with, each agency I've worked with, they have similar data, but it's all completely different as well. They call it different things, so you ask for something and they give you something different. And so it's often a challenge, but data is actually the thing I find most fun. It's the thing you can dig into and tell stories, but it's like I said, often the biggest challenge. And actually, one of the things the railroad industry is going to have to deal with is, how do you share data for planning studies? What should be publicly available? What should be proprietary? Is an ongoing and sort of unresolved question right now. So, what are sort of some of the best practices? One is you have to understand the data. It's not just what does the data say, but what is the data itself. So, for example, is it manually or automatically generated? When I first started at CSX, locomotive 1, 2, 3, 4 was multiple places across the network at the same given time. It was a manually generated number, and so people would just type it in, or train with like 9999. And so you have to understand that that's not a real thing, and work through and process some of that. Some of that, what is included? For instance, dispatching data at a railroad doesn't include information on hand-thrown switches or yard-controlled switches. That just won't be in there. And so if you don't draw conclusions because that data is not in there, what does the data fields mean? I've run into this recently. The date field may not be the same thing in every data set. Sometimes it's the train departure day. Sometimes it's the train arrival day. Sometimes it's when the event happens. And so doing any analysis and analytics and trying to marry those up, you have to understand what does that actually mean, so you can actually get some tangible results. Weirdness, repeated records, ghost records. There's a agency I'm working with where if the transit vehicle requests a signal, it'll create a fake train, and so it'll show extra trains on the system. So you just have to sort of understand that. And then what is measured? GPS data measures the locomotive, not the rear end of the car. So make sure you don't draw conclusions on where you think that train is based on the GPS. Another one is don't rely on averages. Unfortunately, statistically, averages are very easy to calculate, especially big data sets. But in effect, they're meaningless. This here is a chart. That's the exact same average but one has low variability and one has high variability. Those are two vastly different types of operations or different types of data sets. And so you have to consider the data tails when thinking about, train arrival times or departure times or train sizes or, passenger loadings. And with that, I believe it's better to be, precise but not accurate. If for instance, let's say you make a change on a corridor and it leads to every train taking another 20 minutes. That's less of an issue than some trains taking an extra 2 hours, some going 30 minutes quicker, some taking 20 minutes longer, some taking 4 hours longer. It's, you can plan. It's about how your ability to plan. You can plan precision. You can't, but if it's not accurate but not precise, you cannot. So one of the challenges is you guys probably have dealt with this a little bit in academia, is variability and distributions are hard to explain to the general public. Standard deviation is the standard number used or metric used to display, variability, but it's not a well understood concept. I can't even really explain it very well. So how do you compare distributions? How do you compare variability and tell that story, in a understandable, meaningful way? And this is sort of an ongoing challenge I have with a lot of my studies, because I said the story becomes in the changing of variability. So sort of building on that is don't be influenced by outliers. You see this in sort of the general public with whole hosts of things. I find one person that does this or believes this or says this, and that means everybody like them is like that. You cannot overemphasize the long tails. Example, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of college, so I will. That's insane. So let's not do that in other ways as well. And a saying we had at CSX was, do not design the church for Easter Sunday. How do you, you don't design for your outliers. This is actually, building on the last slide, this is actually data from Amtrak arriving in Chicago. I think this is the Chicago to St. Louis train. And so you can see, I said there's a story in the variability, but there's some trains that are extremely late. How do you plan? How do you think about those? They have an effect. Those are the ones that have the biggest impact on your operations, on your corridors, on your planning, but they're not common. So it's finding that right balance. Building on that, exception does not make the rule. So, for example, like at a commuter, commuter line, 95% of the days they're going to have 100% OTP. It's, 5% they're going to have 50, and so they're going to end up with a 90% OTP. How do you, the average is much lower than your vast majority of days. So how do you think about it when it's, a few small events have a major impact on your OTP? And then outliers, what people remember. The number of times I got told something happens all the time that I saw no discernible proof ever happened. I could spend the next hour telling you stories like that. But that's what, or that one time it happened, we have to, be prepared to handle that. And some of that's just human nature, and how do you think about and plan around the human element? So another one is be skeptical of subjective and process data. Subjective data is developed in order to influence or based on memory. And so I'm going to get myself in a little trouble here. ASCE puts out a scorecard every year saying the infrastructure of this country. They're also the ones that get paid to fix it. You be skeptical of that. They may be right, but be skeptical. It is a metric made to influence.
And they give railroads the best score. They don't work on railroads.
Yeah. I always laugh a little bit when I see that come out every year. And one example from my career was in the early 2010s, when I was first starting in the industry. There was expectations that export coal would grow. There were projections that'd be 10 million tons, 20 million tons, 90 million tons, and everyone was making all these plans and we're building capacity, and then overnight it disappeared. Similarly, then there was, the Appalachian coal is going to shift to Illinois Basin. We're going to have to build all this capacity. We're going to have to, do all this planning. Yards were built, and then it disappeared. At some point, one of my career regrets was not being more skeptical of projections coming from, you have to be careful of the sources, that are, serve to serve influence. Another one is sort of isolated field narratives. Field narratives are critical to understanding things, but if, sort of building on, people remember the outliers. So if it's based, that's what they remember, so they're going to remember those incidents. And so, if you can't back it up with multiple people or with, data, always be very careful with that. And then process data. This is the data developed based on processing information. So metrics that are often shared. These are one of the more public information you can get. Unfortunately, have significant data rules. There's significant filters, and so how dates are attached to different sets of data, and so it becomes very difficult to use in a meaningful way. Unfortunately, OTP. There are business rules about when do you throw out a train for being late because of a one-off event or different things like that. So example, these are two railroads train velocities. Happen to pull them, and they happen to be exactly the same. You know what that tells you? Absolutely nothing. It's they just happen to be the same thing, but there's business rules behind them. They have different networks. And so you have to be very careful about how you use some of those metrics. How are they counting velocity? Do they include dwell along the route? Do they, what trains do they include? Metrics and KPI. So, metrics and KPI are effectively sort of processed information, as I described, that is filters and then used often for management of systems. So, you're familiar with these. If you go talk about, velocity and train dwell and car dwell and cars online, or, in a highway sense, sometimes they have vehicles per hour, things like that. But, these are often, as I said, developed from data, have significant filters and data rules. So you have to be sort of very, very careful with them. And also, you have to be careful how you manage to these metrics. And there are a number of ways these have sort of been, I've seen mismanaged. One is you do not use the same metrics to manage everyone. A metric that may be good at a system level. So as I said, as you guys graduate and go and become management or different things, please keep these in mind. So like if your velocity, it may be great on a system-wide. Is a railroad system operating well or poorly? May work, but it doesn't work at an individual level. You don't need, for instance, a dispatcher shouldn't be held to subdivision velocity. At first thought, that makes sense. He's in charge of moving trains, but what also impacts, subdivision velocity? The number of trains. He has no control over that. Number of slow orders. He has no control over that. And so what you end up with is, just low morale. People, won't even try to sort of try and hit a metric they have no control over.
I'll throw another one at you, which is the terrain may differ.
Exactly. So there are a number of other examples I could probably give, but I've been subjected to some of these before, and so you just, make sure you manage, to what they are. And also with that, instead of velocity in many ways an effect, manage the cause. So get to the root cause of something and manage that metric. And so, for example, train length. When CP did PSR, or CN, their train length extended. I would argue that was an effect and not a cause. They made major structural changes to their plans to do that. So, but if you happen to see that and think, wow, that's a cause, and just sort of added and started putting trains together, you end up with not the same benefit. So, if you just put two trains together that don't work, you start running out of route miles, you start adding recrews, you start adding a whole host of things because they're trying to get longer trains. But that's not the point. The point is to reduce cost, not get longer trains. Yeah, there we go. So so make sure you're thinking about, you said, causes, not effects, because you end up with, people will, Maslow's hammer, people will, if all they have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you have a metric, people will try and hit that metric. So be very careful with what metrics you choose because you influence behavior in that way. Sort of building on that is understanding correlation versus causation, as you saw sort of the introductory slide. It's easy to sort of flip those two and draw some incorrect conclusions. Near and dear to my heart, simulation. So this is what I do a lot of. But I actually have found that I enjoy doing the data work that leads to the simulation as much as I actually do the simulation. And simulation effectively is just a tool to create data for you. But one of the challenges is how do you use simulation correctly? And so they're wonderful. They enable what-if questions. No other data analysis can't really do that. What happens, this is actually a picture of the northern part of Chicago, Union Station, Oglesby, and the A2 interlocking. And we did a study looking at, potentially reconfiguring some of those interlockings and some changes in operations. You can't do that through data. You can't sort of, what is the effect of major changes in infrastructure, major changes in operations. And so that's where simulation is critically important. But you have to understand the ability of the tool. Computers are not humans. Railroad operations models actually, they work both better and worse than humans. So humans are more flexible than models. So they can put trains in different spots. They can run them in weird ways. They can take them forward and run backwards. Models can't think in that way, at least the ones I've dealt with. You sort of have to have prescribed routes. So it sort of underestimates the ability to do those things. But it also it's all-knowing. It knows exactly what's going to happen. It's able to predict travel times perfectly and make sort of decisions in that way. So you have to understand, when you're looking at results and looking at animations and different, what you're getting from that these are influenced by those two effects. Actually, here is an image from my last seminar I gave. What we had done at CSX was we had plotted the density, which is effectively a metric of velocity, every day over, I think it was like 7 years. And then we had an intern run a simulation model and compare the two. And so what we found was the model was actually really, really good at measuring the ability of the corridor. It actually, was able to do better than you're actually able to perform. But it couldn't, represent the whole spread of operations. It doesn't affect, when you're holding trains for a customer or your non-dispatching problems. There's things you can do in models to try and model some of that, but you can never fully represent some of that spread in models. And when looking at results and working with clients and working with railroads, you have to understand that dynamic, that don't misrepresent what the model is saying and what it is not. But this is not a flaw of the model. I think I just want to be clear on that. They are fast and accurate and consistently, rational, just like a computer is, and they are not flexible like a human. It is what it is. It is not, so it's not, I said, a flaw. You just have to think about it when you're moving and looking at the results. So the other one, this has been a challenge a lot, is you have to ask the right questions of the right tool. What is, trying to think, they often, is, again, oh, you're the simulation group, or you have tools, answer our question using this. And so sometimes data is the right answer. Sometimes I actually put 4 different simulation tools on here that have sort of different benefits. Viriato is really good for scheduling. RTC, one I've spent a lot of time with, is really good on freight railroads. OpenTrack, been using, working with actually another alum, Toshkin, using for light rail and sort of passenger-only operations. And then AnyLogic is often used for yards and industries. They each have their sort of applications, and make sure you use the right tool for the right question. Inevitably, if you don't, you will get sort of the wrong answer, or it will just take longer and not have quite as an effective of a solution. One thing to keep in mind also is, none of these models will tell you what the capacity of subdivision is or a corridor. They tell you the effects of different decisions, but they won't tell you you can run 12 trains per day or 25 trains per day. It'll tell you as you add trains, you will have degradation, along that perfect curve, but it won't tell you, exactly when you can't run any more trains. And sort of that last point, I sometimes find data can be more effective than modeling because it has all the mess that is in the real world, all the different impacts, all the different variability that models cannot truly account for sometimes. Financial models. The thing to keep in mind is when you're doing planning and analysis and modeling, it's most of the time to feed some type of financial decision. How much track to build, how do you operate, and then it feeds into infrastructure investments, it leads to grant applications, or some of the things I'm working on now. And so, you have to have once you sort of do the simulation to make sure you do it right, it then has to be used correctly on the next step to sort of get the proper analysis, because the mistakes that you can make in data analysis are the same ones you can make in financial models. So one sort of another regret in my career is I've found that the cost of delay is undervalued. So, often, historically how you'd think about, a project is you'd add a siding and reduce delay by X. The problem is that the amount could never justify the building of a project. It just isn't enough, the costs that are used. So this influences, engineering decisions on, saving, delays on slow orders or a whole host of things. And so it was always justified based on, and all the projects I did was based on growth. But some of the challenge with that is the cost of delay is not a linear factor. It is dependent on the corridor, and it's a stepwise function. So, for example here, your delay cost really isn't much until you experience a recrew. So who cares if a train shows up 10 minutes late? It really doesn't mean anything. There's marginal to no cost. And then there's another stepwise as your locomotives miss connections, as your cars make connections. The problem is oftentimes we're just accounting for that linear, that linear portion of the delay. And so it leads to undervaluing the impact of congestion. So it could lead to, congestion's okay because it didn't cost anything. Running trains inefficiently doesn't cost anything because there isn't, we don't have a good understanding of the cost. So, but the challenge is because it is complex, you have to do it on a train by train, corridor by corridor, nature, and so it becomes an extremely difficult sort of financial analysis, data analysis to do that. And so often, you end up with just that linear in a lot of the cost. Another is, I said, many financial models are backward-looking. When trains are added, often the prediction on the cost of the new train is based on the cost of the trains that are currently out there. The problem is, as I said, some of you are aware, there's a non-linear relationship between sort of added volume and delays and velocity. So by adding a train, it slows down every other train and increases its cost. So it is my opinion that often we are undercounting the cost of, again, the cost of delay, of congestion, the cost of added trains, added capacity. Another one is do not, again, when I talked about this earlier, do not ignore cause and effect. Without an understanding of complex systems, purely looking at financial numbers can lead to incorrect conclusions. If you look at a financial balance sheet, the biggest cost a railroad has is its locomotives and crews. If you just look at it at its face, this was a joke we made when we were at the railroad. If the railroad had no customers, or if it had no crews and locomotives, it would run great, based on the financial models. So you have to understand that there is complexity there. You can't just sort of take a line item and just wipe it out. Another example, this is in yard crews. There are some, a crew may be utilized only 10% of the time. A productivity analysis will say, we need to get rid of that crew. We need to save money. The problem is that crew may, when it is working, is allowing every other crew to work. So in that 10% of the time, it's allowing 10 other crews to do their job without delays. So you have to understand, you can't just look at the cost, you have to understand the complexities of systems in order to do that. And I would argue, Twitter recently, they saw that employees are a cost, ignoring that employees tend to bring in revenue as well, and just said, well, we're going to cut half our employees. I think it's a wonderful example of misunderstanding financial cost. I said I would keep some anonymity for the guilty. I don't. Sorry. Facebook example too. Yep. So best practices, or things I was taught in grad school and did not understand at the time, or I ignored. So. So one is different perspectives are important. When I've worked on projects with people from different backgrounds, different jobs, capacity planners, schedulers, design engineers, signal designers, financial analysts, recently with lawyers, they bring a completely different perspective than I do. One example, and it stuck with me, is that we were doing a study looking at, so what is the increased cost or benefit of increasing speed across diamonds, at-grade diamonds? At CSX, at the time, there was a speed restriction. I don't remember, I think it was like 20 or 30 across the diamond, and the hope was, can we increase that to 40? And the finance person I worked with said, well, there is no cost because we're not increasing the budgets. And I don't know if that's the right answer to this day, but it stuck with me and made me think differently about some of these things of, how does that all fit together? How do budgets and, actually practical effects? Because in theory, yes, it increased cost. You're going to have higher dynamic load, all these different things, but if you just don't give it more money, it doesn't actually cost anything. So I said, I remember it to this day, and I still don't have an answer on whether I agree with it or not. But it's just a different perspective. I've hinted at this a couple times. Never, ever forget the human element. Just because you can model something or doesn't mean it's possible. A computer can, with a dispatching simulation, can manage 8 trains at a time, 10 trains at a time. But a human will have to stop and think about one and then think about another. They can't do multiple things at once. Now, the other thing I talked about is humans are risk adverse. They will make decisions to avoid risk. They won't run a train through a crossover because it might, the coupler might break. And then they have a really, really bad day because now both tracks are blocked. So they'll add delay to that train and just run it behind a train in front of it. While a simulation model knows it will never happen and will run a train around. And as I said, there's a whole host of things you can think about and do, in theory that just aren't possible. Another one is, I said, and I talked about a little bit of this with metrics, is that humans act according to their own motivations. People will maximize what they're measured on. They've changed this since then, but when I was there, you had two metrics. You had dwell, so when a train was in a terminal, and velocity when a train was outside a terminal. And so let's just say the trains often got sent just outside the terminal to make sure they were on someone else's clock. It doesn't change anything. It didn't affect the operations, but you're maximizing your own personal metrics. And another example is, as with car inspections, what was found was over time, the number of car defects didn't change. Cars got better maintained, we have better technology, but the number of defects did not change. I would argue there's probably two reasons for that. One is they only had so much time to do the inspection, so they only found what they could find, and then now they're finding different things. And two is they're preserving their own job. You don't want to go be an inspector and not find something. So you have to be, be skeptical or think about, what is happening, and make sure you make the correct sort of decision in response to that. This is one, Chris. I remember you telling, presentations are supposed to be stories, and this is something that's taken me a long time to sort of understand. But with that, what I want to argue is never say this is what the model says alone. Models are logical. You need to understand why the model says what it does. You need to understand it does that because some train's here and does this. That will help you sort of, find the root cause. Models won't necessarily tell you the root cause. But also it helps you explain it to other individuals, to management, to other planners. Because, as I said, models are often black boxes. If somebody just says that's what the model says, I tend to not believe them. And the other thing I often find fun is that you try and use multiple data sets to tell a story. So there are many different sets of data you can get access to. You have sort of dispatch data, you have control point data, and so you have to piece these all together to sort of tell stories of trains, of why they're acting, why they are. Because data doesn't say the why. It'll say you what happened. It will never tell you why. You have to figure that out through the data, through sort of storytelling and thinking through it. And this is for you, Chris. Presentation of data is important. Don't create chart junk. Make sure it's easily legible. Make sure it's clearly tells a story. I also have a confession. Chris always told us to read this book by Edward Tufte in B118. I think he told every grad student. I didn't. I recently. It's obvious. Yeah. I recently was getting frustrated at some charts I saw, and I'm like, I bet there's some resource online I can share with someone about charts. And I did some searching, and the first item that showed up was Edward Tufte's book, and I had shame. So yeah, it's. But yeah, it's you have to, again, with the storytelling element, ultimately you are telling your story through written memos, written reports, and charts. And so you have to make sure they are clear and legible and tell the story you are looking for. And don't create misleading charts or presentations that have lots of animations, please. I'm going to call out someone else. This is USA Today. They are a wonderful example of how not to ever create charts. Confusing volume. making things bigger. I won't call out the news agency that does this with a uneven x-axis to try and influence. But yeah, think about also there's lots of color in this. Tufty will tell you not to do that. He said you have to deal with this with your research papers, with your classes. Work on creating very clean presentations and graphics. Don't have busy backgrounds. It just becomes sort of difficult to tell your story through those things. So, final words. Analytics, I said in simulation, that's what my career is. It's our powerful tools. You can tell lots of really, ask lots of questions and really come up with great answers, but it has to be done correctly. And just sort of words of advice, I said, don't let that outside pressure influence the findings. With clients or supervisors, they want certain answers. They have preconceived ideas of what the model should and should not say. Let the data speak for itself. There are different ways to look at something, but don't let your trustworthiness and honesty get impacted by that. Be humble. I often have a terror that I'm doing something wrong. It's always a dangerous thing to go in and act like you know something and find out you don't. And then the last one is communicate. It's always try and be, have high quality communication. This is something I always have to work on. Be clear, but often do it often. If you're seeing an issue, make sure you tell someone early on. Don't ever surprise anyone. Is always an important sort of lesson. And then last one is take advantage of your time at Illinois. I said I learned a lot from my time here. I said a lot of my sort of lessons and things and success in the industry have come from my time in grad school here. And so I encourage you guys to take advantage of these few years you have and get to know people. And I said it's through the program, I know people at different railroads and different, across the industry that I can talk to and ask questions of because of that. So that's sort of what I had to say. Is there any questions, comments, concerns, disagreements? We
definitely have time for some questions. So, and we've got a lot of people doing data work and analytics work here. So, right. Can you flip on the lights over there, the leftmost switch?
It was a very nice presentation. Thank you for that. And one of the things you said towards the end about always remember that you can be wrong. And you talked previously about the variability in data. The tool that makes me think of is doing like sensitivity analysis.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because that you're not sure about this variable and you have some idea how much you might not be sure. So then if you try all those extreme cases and see how much it influences your outcome, it can kind of give you some confidence. Or say, maybe I shouldn't show this model to somebody, right? Because if I'm wrong on this one, my whole conclusion is wrong. So is that something you incorporate regularly in the data analysis?
Yeah, you are trying to, you always have to sort of adjust variables. So often I will put variability in the model and then it's not quite telling the story or how I think it will. So you go back and, okay, let me adjust that. Let me, instead of including 95% of the events, I include 99, because it's that, how do you handle the outlier too? That's what impacts things. And so it's always a challenge with simulation of, I don't like including outliers, but that's also the thing that affects it. And also what you're talking about is basically what my master's thesis was taking different variables and changing one thing and seeing the impact of that. But it's often a challenge in complex systems to necessarily see the cause and effect, or you're also trying to, in some of the modeling, is to take the actual data. So you take the actual variability of arrival times or train dwells or work events and include that in the model. So it's sometimes the model just isn't acting like you think it should. So you don't necessarily go back and look sensitivity analysis because the inputs are what they are. because you start to, if you start manipulating those too much, you are starting to trend into sometimes the risk of trying to prove an answer that you think you should. So it's definitely a balancing act of making sure you don't stray, but sometimes your clients want, they know something is true or but you have to sort of, how do you prove that is a real challenge.
Sorry, I gave up the microphone already, but just to follow up on that, we were looking at some data sets, and it's like, this isn't doing what we think it should, and my question was, at what point is our data set big enough that we just have to believe the data?
Yes.
As opposed to our gut instinct, right?
Yeah, the comment was, at what point, when you start not seeing what you expect to see in the data, do you have to start trusting it? And with that, I start questioning what's the data actually include. Maybe it's missing things. Like often, examples that I work with, train profile data. It doesn't have yard trains. So if you start drawing conclusions from something that doesn't have every train in it, or the full data set, you almost have to go back to, I always found important, but it's been extremely difficult on the client side, the consultant side to do that, is what was the system that created the data? What was it processed, and how did it get there? Because there's rules, even in the cleanest of raw data, there's rules that removed certain things that may cause and impact your results. And so it's an ongoing challenge, because the people I work with now with the agencies and the railroads, those aren't the people that know the data. They may use it, but so to get the right people that have access to the data and know the root where it came from is extremely difficult. Chris.
Actually, I'll pile on this one as well, and this does relate to some of the lessons that we talk about with our students. But back to one of your early slides, and you don't have to go back there, where you talked about science and data versus intuition and experience. You apologized for bringing that to academia, and I couldn't disagree more. That's just as important here as it is anywhere else. You have to understand, as you said later in your presentation, what it is you're measuring, and that's not all going to come from just abstract numbers. You have, and we of course, I just had this conversation with a student the other day. It's really important to have domain knowledge as well as statistical and quantitative knowledge. And the other lesson that I learned early on, fortunately it wasn't me that made this mistake, but it was some of our colleagues where I used to work. They were conducting a in those days this was a lot of money, $10,000 worth of tests, and they weren't monitoring the data. And guess what? The data were not being recorded correctly. So I learned, as the data come in, keep checking. Does it make sense? And that's another thing I often talk about in class. And in fact, I even ask exam questions about this sort of thing. You should understand what order of magnitude at least your data should be telling you. So if you're measuring some process or you've calculated some process and you're getting a result that's this small and it should be this big, something's wrong. Don't just blindly follow the numbers. And again, another colleague actually was just relating a story about some students who did exactly that in his class. So it's a really important lesson, and it's a good lesson to learn in school when all it matters is, a class exercise or an experiment. It's not a good exercise. It's not a good lesson to learn when you're talking about multi-million dollars worth of capital investment or something like that.
I think I've told some people, I think estimation is an undervalued skill. I also call it sometimes my BS meter. You need a strong one to this just looks wrong. There's something wrong here. There's something wrong with the data. This is not what I think it would be. And so, get skeptical and start digging into instead of, presenting a number that, that is wrong. Figure out why is there some number that doesn't make sense. And it helps prevent a lot of issues when you can identify, I said, to your point, something's just order of magnitude off.
I think Arthur's got a question up here.
First of all, thanks for the presentation. It's very good to see this overview of the data process. For me, what is important, what is before getting the data and after processing the data. So we need to understand everything on both sides of the data. But my question is that you said that simulations doesn't tell you the capacity of a certain corridor or network. And you have said that the data, sometimes it's better to use raw data to to do that. So what are your thoughts about using PTC onboard log data or even record data to predict the capacity or the delay time in certain corridors?
So how I think about capacity a little bit is, again, it's sort of that delay cost. When does it start leading to a significant number of recrews? And so you start there and work your way backwards to start to figure out and think about, because like you said, delay itself is not that expensive, without it's those other things. And so capacity is a financial question. We keep thinking about it as an operational one, but it's really a financial one. You can increase the capacity of a location by running it worse. Like that's just how it is. And so you have to think through, okay, so or it's thinking about the level of service required for customers. So you sort of have to start at those two things and then work your way backwards into the data, into the simulation. You can't start with those things and come up with a capacity, I feel like. You have to sort of start with what is my level of service, what is my threshold, and work my way backwards and then see if you can tell in the data when that line has been crossed.
Well, great presentation. Thanks for that. It's good to see that the industry in general is moving. Sensors are getting cheaper, and people, despite of being a very conservative industry, they're changing and willing to accept more data. And my question is, I think the perfect scenario is when you have a question and then you can plan like, okay, I'm going to do my data collection and I'm going to answer this question. But what about the inverse? Because right now, and I saw this during my master's and also now working, we have a bunch of data and we don't have the clear questions what to do with this data. So the question is, what is your approach when you find yourself in this kind of situation?
That's great, yeah, because sometimes you have to, you're digging in and trying to figure out the question you're going to ask of it. That's where some of these newer sort of data analysis tools are really helpful. Tableau is a popular one that I've used. It's also knowing, sometimes you just have to process the data itself. Sometimes, I have to take the data and then process it to sort of figure out certain things. And so that requires, as I said, learn databases, Microsoft Access, SQL Server, Oracle, learning coding, because it said the raw data itself sometimes doesn't tell you. You have to take it several steps. Now with the data set, it's difficult. You sort of just have to trial and error, to be honest, is what it comes down to, is you try something and take a look at it. You try, you manipulate it in a different way and look at it. It's with big data sets, you can't do that in Excel, I guess is what I'm saying. A lot of times you have to use higher level data tools to play with the data because you don't know what it says. But make sure you don't go in with, so the scientific method you have a hypothesis before going in, but don't go in with a conclusion that this is what it's going to say. That's not an uncommon event, that I've seen. So yeah, I can't give you a really great answer with that. But I said, sometimes it's just you have to, you have a general idea that the question you're trying to answer. But yeah, for instance, example is I worked with, when I was in the engineering department, we dealt with a lot of geometry data. And so there was a lot of, what does this actually tell us? You have foot by foot data, 1 million rows. And a lot of times it doesn't tell you anything because the data is not aligned. So you have to do a lot of work to, each measurement is taken by GPS, or because the distance between records is based on the tachometer, it's actually 1.02 feet, not 1 foot. And so the next car, it takes it 1.035 feet, and so you can't overlay it. So you have to sometimes do a significant amount of processing yourself before you can actually ask the questions you want to ask.
So, hey Mark. So popular process improvement technique that I've seen across a lot of industries, particularly manufacturing, is something called like Lean Six Sigma. Mm-hmm. Do you see the railroads using that a lot in terms of all this data that you've got, and does it get fed into something that it really?
I was gonna talk about in this. That's actually sort of like delay cost. I think it's something that not just railroads, industries as a whole, we're seeing they don't, how do you price in or understand or risk? Because safety stock, Six Sigma is like, we're going to get very lean and remove all the safety stock and robustness into systems. And so how do you quantify or financially justify having excess? Because companies in today's age don't, that's waste. We saw it with COVID. That's why we're still struggling to recover from COVID, to be honest, is we don't have recoverability built into a lot of our systems. And so I guess my response to that is, yes, I've seen it a lot. I'm somewhat skeptical because we don't have a good way, and it's just a challenge of how do you price in or quantify risk. Even capacity is risk. What is the risk of a major delay or a major impact? What is what is extra crews? It's cover risk. And so I think it's a challenge in the industry and not just in the railroads, but of how do you plan for that? I don't have a good answer.
I think we'll switch to our online participants because the questions are pouring in. First of all, you're being complimented on your presentation. But this question is regards RTC. Have you experienced improvements on simulated data using logs from Wabtec's TMDS when analyzing model accuracy and precision?
I'm not familiar with that data set, but as data has gotten more accessible and available, we're able to do more things with models. But inherently, there's still, you can get better inputs, you can put in more variability into the models, but it's still the model. So you can put in, there were a couple studies I did at CSX where we put in all those failure events and all those slow orders, and we got pretty close, was out there. But what we found was, when we did that, it gave you a very similar answer to when you didn't put all that complexity in there. It didn't fundamentally change your answer of where to build capacity or how much to build. And so sometimes it's just not worth that level of detail in the model. Again, making sure you get fast, accurate answers. Sometimes the simple is better and gives you the same answer as putting in all the data and all the complexity that, sometimes is available to us today.
Okay, next question. Have you used any throttle notch data? And so, what tools do you use when modeling locomotive activity by throttle notch?
That's not something I do too much. When I was doing locomotive productivity, we looked a lot at horsepower hours, tonnage ratings, things like that. So that was not, I wasn't necessarily using the locomotive outputs, but more in the plans and looking at them. That being said, so on the transit side, we've recently we have something similar, an event data recorder. So we have the speed and the location of these transit vehicles over a distance, and it's been fantastic for validating models, to be honest. It tells us exactly what trains are going, what speeds where, and so we can see, are we missing a slow order? Are we missing, because again, the human element, the speed limit's 30, but because the vehicle doesn't, the operator doesn't want to go that speed for a number of reasons. So no, I have not used that data specifically, but I've used similar kind of stuff in different ways.
Okay, next question. Another compliment on your presentation. This listener says, although I agree that simulation can't reliably quantify capacity by itself, such as trains per hour, if we hold the infrastructure model constant and the traffic mix constant, and then incrementally add traffic, one can often identify an inflection point in the train delay metrics that provides a clue that the available capacity is becoming saturated. Can you comment on that?
I agree with that. You just have to be careful with the human element, because where the model will have the inflection point will be at a higher volume than is actually possible. And so, but that sort of to my point is that that's looking at the effects. The model itself doesn't necessarily tell you the capacity. So that's sort of how you have to use the outputs of the model, what it's telling you, to try and come up with an answer. So, but again, often you don't operate at that breaking point, and so it becomes a challenge. Often railroads don't want to do that at that location, that tight. So it's working through some of that.
Okay, next question comes from a former academic colleague of yours. And he'd like your opinion. My proposal, sometimes providing a bad answer is better than providing no answer. Engineers know that you can't reduce the full complexity of a real-life situation to a single number, but if someone is making a spreadsheet and they only included one number, it's better for you to provide that number in a straightforward, honest way than to leave that number blank. This often comes up when engineers are asked to estimate the cost or schedule of a project.
And make sure you have significant contingency with that, and have humility. I always get when I'm in conferences and different things, the more convinced someone is that their answer is right, the less I trust them, to be honest, because of those things. So yeah, I completely, as long as I think caveats are important with that. But yeah, it's sometimes you just have to have a number for people to start thinking about and start working with, but just making sure people understand what that number is, because you're now creating data that people could then misuse and misunderstand.
Okay. Can you please discuss impacts of mixed passenger and freight on capacity? Impact of delay on your passenger train is more costly because of missed connections.
I'm trying to think how to. We'll talk about that in the graduate seminar I'm going to be a part of here soon. That is, if you go into the public documents, that is what I tried to do I was recently involved with a hearing and a study on the Gulf Coast with Introduction to Passenger Service. If you can go into those, that's basically what we tried to do. I think it was in our supplemental data, supplemental report. So that's sort of the challenge is, again, it was with that case is much like I just described, is the numbers themselves in the model just don't tell you that much because they're if they're taken in isolation. And so it's how do you understand the risk to the greater system, risk of recrews, things like that is something I've started to rely on with other locations as well to try and tell that story. But it's because you can't. Is my belief that you can't compare a model to reality straight up. You sort of have to work through to, what is the model base case versus the model sort of future case, what is the impact, and then apply that back to the actuals. And so you sort of have to, I guess, and that's one way to do that is to then apply the impact you see in the model back to the actuals and try and figure out the misconnections and the recrews and the different sort of impacts to your systems.
Yeah, and I would actually personally question the premise of this questioner's point that the impact of delay on passengers is more costly due to misconnections. I actually think it's probably more costly for freight. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars or more there. So anyway, next question is an observation from this individual is quite experienced in the field. Dispatchers are risk averse, mostly not because of what might happen to a train. Truly proficient dispatchers are good at applying experience to situations, but to the response from management to something the dispatcher can't control and couldn't foresee. The supply of truly proficient dispatchers in the modern environment is questionable.
I don't disagree with that. Yeah, it's also going back to the human element that people will respond to what they got yelled at yesterday about. So you see that a lot with dispatchers or different employees. If they got yelled at for not doing something the day before, they will do it differently the next day, and then ignore something else. And so it's always it's almost a challenge of whack-a-mole sometimes on those exact things that because you're trying to sort of optimize based on what you got yelled at the day before.
And the last comment is yet another former academic colleague of yours complimenting you on your presentation. So do we have any other questions from the room? Okay. Hang on.
So with the big drive to have data behind every decision being made, how do you go to a group of executives or any decision maker and say, here's what the data says, but here's what my intuition says in contrast to that?
You're getting to the crux of the question. It's it comes down to the management you're dealing with. I said it changed while I was at CSX, that opinion of how to do those things. Sometimes the way you do it is you add, with transparency, you add your intuition into the data. So, we know, just how you look at it. You do some of those things. Because you don't want to go full intuition, but also the data won't tell you the full thing. So sometimes we know this will probably cause that, and so we look at this other data set to try and guess what that is. So you sort of try and piecemeal it together to try and make it fact-based. But again, you always want to be careful. Just make sure you're transparent and honest and humble when you do those things, so you're not, so they know the assumptions that go into it. One thing I often found I thought was a better way to do things was to have them back into, instead of saying the benefit of this is saying you need this benefit to make this justified. And so by doing that, then they could use their intuition and say, yes, I think that project will have that type of benefit. Instead of us coming up with an arbitrary, we think the benefit is X. Sometimes that was a little bit easier to work with. And left that into the management's hand. You provide the data to sort of get the framework, but left it in management's hand to sort of use their intuition and not based on mine.
One more. That's good.
The long walk.
Yeah, sorry to be all the way across the room. I was fascinated to hear you say sometimes it's hard to get the data, even within an organization. I was wondering, over your career, have you noticed any trends in that?
Well, as I learned how to get the data without going through IT, it became a whole lot easier. Yeah, and then I got myself on a list, and so IT didn't like me very much. It gets easier once you identify the right person. The challenge is getting that one person that understands it and is willing to work with you and understand it and provide access and tell you the database to pull from. As a consultant, it's darn near impossible. That's the biggest risk to our schedule and budget on all my projects, is waiting on data from the client. And I say that at the front end of every single project, and yet every single time it's that. We try and put in risk mitigation, and yet it's still the number one issue. So it's not necessarily getting better, I guess, but when you're inside an organization, you can learn who to talk to, who's the person that understands it, who's the subject matter experts for that. Because so the person who knows the engineering data might not be the person that knows the operations data, that might not know the financial data. So it's becoming best friends with those people is really the trick. But as an outside consultant, I don't quite have that benefit anymore. And that's actually one of the biggest differences from being at a railroad versus being at a consultant that I miss, is I'm an outsider. I don't have access to that stuff. I have to beg, plead, to get any of that information. It allows me to work on projects, with different agencies and different railroads, and I love that across the country. But now it's much more difficult to answer some of those questions than I did before.
I'll just add to that, taking the long view, as someone who's a year or so older than you. When I entered when I entered railroading in 1988, huge amounts of this data just simply didn't exist.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, there's much more data available. The sort of institutional question of whether it's easier to get it. And it also is all about trust too. That's another thing.
Yes.
If the people who are giving you the data trust you not to misuse it, or and so that's just like an awful lot of other elements of the business and world. So
Completely agree.
I think we'll conclude here, and I guess what I just want to do is a final thank you.